Welcome to Breaking Barriers, where we're exploring African American history and today's social justice issues. Change starts with awareness, so listen and learn. I'm your host, Stephanie, and let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Breaking Barriers, the podcast about African American history and contemporary social justice issues. I'm so happy to see you all again. If this is your first time, welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to have you here. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back. I hope you enjoyed the previous episodes. Today's episode is going to be about mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow and everything that's involved from our history to now and everything in between. So let's get started. So to begin with, I want to talk about the Jim Crow era and kind of just talk about how that got us to where we are, the stuff we kind of saw a little bit before that and what kind of led to Jim Crow and everything in between. So if you haven't heard the Jim Crow laws, then let's talk about it. The Jim Crow laws were a collection of local and state statutes that legalized racial segregation in the South and led to the disenfranchised Black American through, the late 19th century to the 20th century. So the name of the law itself came from a blackface character, Jim Crow, and they kind of reinforced a system of white supremacy and racial hierarchy. So before we had the Jim Crow laws, we had the Black Codes, which were implemented predominantly in the southern area of the United States. And these were kind of restrictive laws that were designed to control the labor and behavior of formerly enslaved people. So the Black laws were enacted in the southern states after the Civil War. They kind of restricted African Americans from having any economic independence. They were solely reliant on the land of white people. These laws required African Americans to sign labor contracts that were restricting them from their movement and limited them in their own rights. So eventually we had federal interventions, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, which eventually nullified the Black Codes. But the Black Codes did lead into the Jim Crow laws. So it did kind of just continue to perpetuate racial discrimination and segregation in the civil rights movement. So if we hop back to the Jim Crow laws, they pretty much mandated segregation in public spaces such as schools, restaurants, bathrooms, clubs, anything that you could think of that you could need in that public space. They were labeled whites only or colored, and that's just kind of how things were going because of these Jim Crow laws. So as I stated earlier, this does lead to the disenfranchisement of the Black community, the Black family, a Black individual, because this is where voting rights for Blacks in America is severely restricted through poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and just outright intimidation and violence towards Black people when trying to go and vote. So even though we see this mostly in the South, as far as the Jim Crow laws go, we do see it in the northern and western states as well. Also practice segregation, discrimination, we see it a little bit less, and it's not as harshly as we're seeing in the South. So in these northern and western states, we're seeing a lot more of de facto segregation in housing, education, and employment, and it's very widespread. This widespread segregation is also seeping into cultural norms, so social interactions and entertainment. Like even at the time, Black performers were expected to enter and exit through separate doors when, going to their workplace. They have separate dressing rooms, even when performing for a white audience. Of course, we had people who were kind of defying these laws to create more change and create equity across all, because there's no reason that we are having white-only bathrooms and white-only restaurants. So people were using these white-only bathrooms and facilities when it was a possibility, when they were able to do it, and kind of creating their own businesses and institutions so that they didn't have to support these white-only restaurants and whatever it was, and supporting civil rights organizations that were pushing for a change. The NAACP was also working very hard to challenge segregation, which is how we led to Brown versus Board of Education, which I talked about in my last episode. So if you didn't watch it, go check it out. But Brown versus Board of Education declared state laws establishing separate public schools for Black and white students to be unconstitutional. So this is when we saw the integration of white schools. So like I said earlier, these laws are making it really difficult for Black people to have their own economic independence. So these laws were not just about segregation, but also about maintaining economic control over the African population. So many Black Americans were trapped in exploitative sharecropping arrangements where they were not really in control of their own funds, their own actions, their own labor. So eventually, it just continued to perpetuate poverty in the Black community. Black Americans were also not able to get, high-paying jobs. They were forced to take these low-paying jobs that nobody wanted to do, but they didn't really have any other choice because they needed a job. They needed to work. They needed money. And they were also excluded from jobs where there were labor unions. So they weren't able to advocate for themselves or advocate for other people to get better wages or better working conditions. So now I kind of want to hop to the 20th century and kind of see how this escalated and how it led us to where we are. So there are a lot of factors that have led to mass incarceration and the amount of people that we have seen be incarcerated in the last, 100 years. But one of the biggest ones is the war on drugs. So in 1971, the president, Richard Nixon, had introduced this government-led initiative in the United States that was aimed to reduce the amount of illegal drug use. He called it the war on drugs, and he declared that illegal drug use and selling and production of illegal drugs was the number one enemy. So the policies and the measures associated with the war on drugs led to a significant increase in the incarceration rates, particularly in the Black and Latino community. So the war on drugs was stated to be, to reduce drug use, to kind of support the public health and, lower addiction rates and lower overdoses and stuff like that. The war on drugs was also expected to reduce crime. So they did this by targeting drug dealers and drug users to kind of aim to decrease the association of criminal activity. So in the Nixon administration, it was put out in 1971, and he declared public enemy number one and officially starting the war on drugs. And eventually in 1973, Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, and this was to coordinate the two of those things together to enforce the federal drug laws. Then we see it escalate through the Reagan administration, and he continues the war on drugs through the 1980s. He increases the funding for the drug law enforcement and introduces more strict drug policies. Reagan also introduces the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This establishes mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, which leads to longer prison terms and a reduction in judicial discretion. This is not a decision that's being made by juries or judges anymore. This is a minimum sentence that you're getting for any drug-related charges. Another critical change that we are seeing in the Reagan administration is the crack versus powder cocaine disparity. This law kind of imposes harsher penalties for crack cocaine, which is more prevalent in the Black community because it is cheaper than powder cocaine, and creating that racial disparity between the two in sentencing. Even though they're the same thing, causing the same results, one's just a little bit more expensive than the other, and that more expensive one is found predominantly in white communities. So they aren't going after these, rich white people in their mansions that are doing coke. It's not that they don't think that they're doing coke. They know they're doing coke. They just don't care because this war on drugs is specifically targeted towards the Black community. So they're going directly after crack cocaine. So as we're continuing through presidents, we're also seeing it in the Bush and Clinton administration. They continue to emphasize very strict drug enforcement policies. In 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act is signed by Bill Clinton, which includes a provision called the Three Strikes Law, which mandates life sentencings to individuals convicted of 3 or more serious criminal offenses. The Three Strikes Law has a very, very, very big impact on mass incarceration. Although it says, very serious criminal offenses, this is used on people who have drug offenses. So if someone is charged with something very minor and they also have 2 other drug charges and they're in the Black community or the Latino community, they're likely going to be sent to jail for the rest of their life. So the Three Strike Law has a very detrimental effect on the Black community. They are intentionally over policing the Black communities and catching as many people as they can, anything that is drug related, and catching them as many times as they can, and essentially putting them in prison for life. They end up with a life sentence because they have hit that 3 strikes. So now that's it. There's nothing that can do past that, and that's really kind of how we led to mass incarceration. There are so many people in prison that have been in prison for such a long time because of this 3 strikes rule. So now I kind of want to talk about the more modern end of this, directly speaking about mass incarceration. So the dramatic increase in the prison population. So from the 1970s to the 2000s, the U.S. prison population grew exponentially. The number of people incarcerated for drug offenses specifically increased from 40,000 in the 1980s to 500,000 by the 2000s. That's 500,000 people. Just to put that in perspective, that's 500,000 people in prison by 2000s, from the 80s to the 2000s. That's 20 years. That's 20 years. That's it. And we have 500,000 people in prison on drug charges. So this is where we're seeing immense disenfranchisement of the Black community. People are being removed from their families. It's lack of income. That's a whole other person who is working and providing for their family who is no longer there to provide for their family. That completely destroys the Black family structure. This is where we're starting to see missing, fathers, people who have absent fathers because they're now in prison because of this 3 strike law and the war on drugs. This just leads to long-term economic disadvantages for people in the Black community because they're losing such a big contribution to their community. Their lack of people. There's so many people who are being taken out of this community who were providers and parents and just had an effect on this community, and they're now gone. This also leads to, difficulties of finding employment and housing, things that, create stability in life. We're also seeing legal and social ramifications because many states impose very restrictive voting rights for people who have a felony on their record. This, again, leads to social control of the Black community and the Latino community because we're not able to vote and leave an impact and, use our voice to make change because there's a felony on their record. This also contributed to the public perception of the Black and Latino communities. They were already, had their eyes directly on them and had these, hateful ideas of who they were. But now, because they are being completely targeted by the war on drugs, now they look even worse in the eyes of the community because they look like they are, selling and doing drugs at an exponential rate compared to the white community when they're not. It's happening the same in each community. It's just being specifically targeted in this one community. And believe it or not, the war on drugs was really not effective for what it was so-called meant to be. It really didn't lower the use of drugs. Essentially, it just fueled a massive and costly prison system. So unfortunately, this is something that we're still dealing with to this day. This is not something that there has been, reform on, that has been a big impact that has changed this. This is something we are still dealing with to this day that has not changed. And there are so many people fighting to make a change as far as this, but there's so many people that are pushing back on that are, pushing to enforce the same things that have been happening for decades. So now I want to talk about the new Jim Crow. The concept of the new Jim Crow is articulated by a scholar and a civil rights activist named Michelle Alexander. She wrote a book in 2010. It's called The New Jim Crow. Mass Incarceration is the Age of Colorblindness. Really, really good book. Go check it out. If you're interested in this kind of information and learning new stuff, it's a really, really good book. She does a really good job kind of explaining all of this and talking about what we can do and what needs to be done. So the new Jim Crow refers to a systematic racial control through the criminal justice system, and kind of how we are continuing to just control the Black community through something different. This is the mass incarceration is the new way of segregation and social control of the Black community. So as we just talked about, we are seeing a lot of these people being imprisoned because of the war on drugs and drug offenses. So African Americans are incarcerated at a significantly higher rate than white Americans. Despite there being similar drug use across both communities and most communities, African Americans are far more likely to be arrested, convicted, and receive much harsher sentences for drug-related offenses. Obviously, there are white people in prison because of drug offenses, but there are a significantly amount more of African Americans and Latinos in prison because of these drug offenses, and they have much harsher convictions. So there's a lot of solutions that can kind of impact mass incarceration. I don't think that there is one, solution that's going to fix everything. There's no one all be all. That's just not possible. There are many factors that can play a role in decreasing mass incarceration. So let's talk about those. So the first one I want to talk about is sentencing reform. So eliminating mandatory minimum sentences. There's no reason for this. Absolutely none. We have judges and juries for a reason. They should have their discretion as to what this person should be sentenced to. Each case should be considered on a case-to-case basis and kind of taking in each factor of each person's story and what is going on in their life, because everybody's case is different. There's no one-size-fits-all type of thing. There are factors that play into the reason that the person is there. So there should be, a jury or a judge that is taking these factors in consideration and then, finding a sentence that is just and fit. Also, we should be reducing sentence lengths, especially for non-violent drug offenses. There's absolutely no reason that someone is in prison for a decade or more for non-violent drug offenses. We also need to just completely scratch the 3 strikes rule. This isn't baseball. Get that out of here. There's absolutely no reason that someone is getting a life sentence. A life sentence for 3 strikes. Especially when we're speaking of drug offenses, there is absolutely no reason that you are in prison for life for non-violent crimes. Like, I understand repeat offenders, and there are other solutions to prison. There are other ways to create change. Prison doesn't have to be the one, especially for non-violent crimes. So let's scratch that. At least change it. We need some change on that one. This is another really big one, which is decriminalization and legalization. So the first part of this is decriminalization for drug possession. So drug treatment over incarceration. Let me say that again for you. Drug treatment over incarceration. We need to shift from criminalizing drug possession to treating it as the public health issue that it is. It is a public health issue. An addiction is a disease. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It is a disease, whether this person started taking drugs because they wanted to, needed to, whatever it was. When it leads to addiction, it becomes a disease. It is not something that you can just cold turkey and just be like, okay, whatever. No, this is something that people need help with. Just like, you get sick or, you have a mental health crisis, that's not something that you're just dealing with on your own. So we need to start treating addiction as the disease that it is, offering treatment and rehabilitation instead of prison time. Because at the end of the day, if you are putting this person in prison because they have a drug addiction, as soon as they get out, they're going to go right back to having that addiction. That doesn't change anything, and then they're just going to end up right back in prison. We're ending up in the same cycle over and over again. We need a solution to that, and decriminalization is the solution. The next part of that is legalization. Legalization when it comes to marijuana. So reducing prison populations. So the next part of that is legalization. Legalization when it comes to marijuana. Reducing prison populations would be very simple if we legalize marijuana to decrease the number of people incarcerated for the possession and distribution of marijuana. There are so many people in prison because of it. Our prisons are filled and filled and filled and filled and overcrowded, overfilled, overpopulated because of this, because of the war on drugs. Get rid of that. Our prisons would cut down by so many if we get rid of that. So kind of tying back into what I said earlier, would be diversion programs. So instead of incarceration, treatment. This is another option as far as, mental health treatment or addiction treatment. Treating those people with what they actually need. Meeting them where they are and providing what they truly need, not incarcerating them. So with judge's discretion, having someone, go to a mental health facility or a addiction treatment facility instead of being incarcerated. Another big thing is re-entry programs. So having that smooth transition from being released from prison and figuring out how to now navigate the world as someone who has a felony. We need to provide resources and support to individuals who are transitioning from prison to society. Because there are a lot of things that have now changed because you have a felony on your record. It's going to be a lot harder to find a job. It's going to be a lot harder to find housing, to find resources that are helpful for you, whether, you were dealing with drug addiction or you were put in there for nonviolent drug offenses. This is something that you now have to identify with and figure out how to navigate moving forward because of that. Having a smooth reentry into society would reduce the recidivism rates that we are seeing. The amount of people who are being released and entering right back into prison because they didn't have anybody to help them or provide resources for the things that they needed is really crazy. Because how are you going to go into society with absolutely no support? You have no idea where to get a job, where to find housing because people are not accepting you because of your record. So like I just mentioned, another option is preventing recidivism. And we can do this by introducing educational and job training. And this can be done while they are still incarcerated. If they are aware of the fact that they're going to be getting out in the next year or so, start that job training, start that education so that they have something to fall back on when they are released. Because they are being released from prison with, parole officers that are expecting them to get a job and to find housing and to be able to provide for themselves. And it's really hard to do that by yourself when you don't know where to go or who to reach out to or who can provide some support for you. A change that we can make in the policy kind of area would be reform in bail practices. So eliminating cash bail. I don't ever plan on going to prison, but I know I would be stuck there if I was sent to prison because I don't got cash on hand to just be tossing out. That's not realistic. Moving towards a system that assesses the risk of a flight and danger to the community over cash bail would be very helpful because the cash bail system that we have now is very disproportionately affecting the Black community and low income communities. Implicit bias training is another big factor. So educating law enforcement, from police officers to judges and prosecutors, can reduce that implicit bias that contributes to racial disparities and sentencing. So we all have bias. If you could sit in front of me and say you don't have bias, you're lying. Everyone has bias, whether it's something big, small, whatever it is, everybody has bias. So addressing that and making people aware of their bias makes it a lot easier to have just and equitable results. So there's a bunch more of solutions that can contribute to mass incarceration and decreasing those numbers. But the last one that I want to talk about, this one really, really gets me. This one gets just under my skin. And this one I could harp on all day long. So this one is reducing private prisons. Let's just get rid of those. Because why do we have those? Why are people making profit off of people being incarcerated? That doesn't make any sense. Why is money going directly into the pocket of people based on the number of people being incarcerated? Reduce profit motive. Get rid of that. Incentivizing the amount of people in prison is crazy. I get it. They have labor in prison, whatever. I don't even really get that either. But a company that is not, the government, this isn't a government prison. This is a privately owned prison. I don't know, y'all. That just don't make sense to me. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. So private prisons are profit driven, meaning their profitability depends on keeping the prison full. And at this point, we're beyond full. We are overpopulated, overcrowded. This creates a financial incentive to maintain and increase incarceration rates. It is somebody's job to make sure these prisons are full, and they are making bank off of it. Bank. If you don't believe me, let me give you the numbers. In recent years, Core Civic has reported annual revenues exceeding $1.8 billion. Billion with a B, $billion. If that didn't get you, the Geo Group has reported revenues around $2.4 billion. These companies derive their income from government contracts to house inmates and detainees, which are typically based on per diem, per prisoner. Meaning each prisoner that comes in, more money in their pockets. So they want these prisons to be overcrowded and overpopulated. Mass incarceration is fueling their pockets. That's not crazy? That's crazy. People are making profit off of this. By continuing to control the Black community, they are fueling their pockets like they always have. Making money off the back of the Black community. Is this anything new? No. Is it crazy? Yes. So understanding this historic continuum you see from Black codes to Jim Crow to mass incarceration with the war on drugs to the new Jim Crow, having... Nope. Try that again. So understanding this historic continuum you see from Black codes to Jim Crow to the war on drugs to the new Jim Crow reveals how deeply entrenched racial control is in the fabric of America. Our society is so wrapped around racial control. that we have seen it for hundreds of years. It's as if nothing has changed. We make 2 steps forward to take 5 steps back. And things are changing, but are they really changing? Or are they just being restructured to look a little bit different? It's a sobering reminder that while laws change, the underlying structures are still racist. Those racial inequalities are the foundation of all of the systems that we see in America. The only way that we can make change that sticks and that is true change is through collective action. Using your voice, using somebody else's voice, sharing the message, doing whatever you can to get the word out, to create collective action. That is the only way that we are going to change the cycle and build a new foundation for the things we are seeing in America. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first episode, please go watch the first couple episodes. If you've seen all of them, thank you so much. But please like and subscribe. Please share this with other people. Comment. Tell me what you think. If there's any new topics you want to hear, please comment them. And yeah, I'll see you in the next episode. Have a good day. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.